audience discussion. George can spend years quietly supporting his children, but one emotional failure overshadows countless acts of love. Meemaw, meanwhile, often escapes lasting criticism because the emotional memory she leaves behind is laughter rather than discomfort. That is an extraordinary advantage. But it also reveals something uncomfortable about us. As viewers, we like to believe we're objective. We're not. We judge actions through emotion first and logic second. If someone makes us smile, we search for reasons to excuse them. If someone frustrates us, we search for reasons to blame them. Meemaw understands this instinctively, even if she never consciously manipulates it. She knows how to keep conversations light. She knows how to redirect tension. She knows that confidence often sounds more convincing than accountability. And because she knows those things, very few people inside the Cooper family challenge her for long. Not because they can't, because confronting the funniest person in the room always makes everyone else feel like the problem. That is the hidden power of charisma. It doesn't eliminate consequences, it redistributes them. Instead of the charismatic person carrying the emotional weight of their decisions, everyone else quietly carries the discomfort of deciding whether it is even worth confronting them. Eventually, most people stop trying, not because they've been persuaded, because they've been exhausted. And once an entire family begins adapting to one person's emotional gravity, instead of expecting that person to adapt with everyone else, you are no longer looking at isolated conflict. You are looking at a family system that has reorganized itself around one remarkably lovable, remarkably complicated woman. The Cooper family didn't solve Meemaw's behavior. They organized their lives around it. That is the difference between a healthy family and one that is quietly adapting to a recurring emotional pattern. When psychologists study family systems, they rarely focus on one person's behavior in isolation. Instead, they ask a different question. Funhao, does everyone else change in response to that behavior? Asterisk, because over time, families don't just react to repeated patterns. They absorb them. They build routines around them. They stop asking whether something is healthy and start asking how to live with it. That is exactly what happened with Meemaw. Nobody truly expected her to change. Mary expected resistance. Georgie expected encouragement, even when he probably needed correction. Sheldon expected exceptions. Missy expected to quietly adjust. Different expectations, same conclusion. Everyone learned that adapting to Meemaw was easier than confronting her. That shift matters because expectations shape relationships more than intentions ever do. Once a family decides that one member is simply the way they are, accountability begins to disappear. Behaviors that would normally start difficult conversations instead become predictable inconveniences. Instead of asking, "How do we address this?" the family unconsciously begins asking, "How do we work around it?" That is emotional accommodation. And emotional accommodation often feels like peace. In reality, it is frequently just conflict avoidance wearing a friendlier face. Notice how each member of the Cooper family develops a different strategy for managing Meemaw. Mary argues, but she also anticipates defeat before many conversations even begin. She knows that challenging her mother often ends with a joke, a deflection, or the rest of the family quietly siding with the person who seems more relaxed. Eventually, even justified concerns begin to sound repetitive because they've been dismissed so many times before. George takes another approach. Rather than escalating disagreements, he often lets them pass. He chooses stability over confrontation, understanding that some battles create more stress than resolution. On the surface, this looks like patience. Underneath, it reflects a family dynamic where maintaining short-term harmony becomes more important than addressing long-term patterns. Georgie adapts by embracing Meemaw's worldview. Instead of questioning her methods, he leans into them. Her approval reinforces his own instinct to take risks, bend rules, and trust charm to solve problems. Rather than balancing his impulsiveness, the relationship often amplifies it. Sheldon adapts differently. He learns that Meemaw is the safest person to approach when he wants understanding without immediate challenge. That makes her emotionally comforting, but it also means he receives fewer opportunities to practice compromise with the one adult most capable of reaching him. Then there is Missy, perhaps the quietest adaptation of all. She asks for less, not because she needs less, because she has learned that the emotional space in the family is already crowded. That is how family systems maintain equilibrium. Each person unconsciously accepts a role that keeps the system functioning, even when the system itself isn't functioning well. Mary becomes the enforcer. George becomes the peacemaker. Sheldon becomes the exception. Georgie becomes the risk-taker. Missy becomes the invisible stabilizer. And Meemaw, she remains the untouchable center everyone else adjusts around. Psychologists call this emotional homeostasis, the tendency of families to preserve familiar dynamics even when those dynamics create pain. Change threatens the system because everyone has built their identity around predictable roles. Ironically, unhealthy stability often feels safer than healthy uncertainty. That is why confronting Meemaw becomes so difficult. Changing her behavior wouldn't only affect her, it would require everyone else to redefine who they've become in relation to her. Mary would no longer need to carry every boundary alone. George might have to voice disagreements he'd long avoided. Georgie would lose the comfort of unconditional validation. Sheldon would face more consistent expectations. Missy might finally have room to stop being the child who quietly copes. Real change would reshape the entire family. That is an intimidating prospect, so instead they choose adaptation, not consciously, not maliciously, simply because it is easier to preserve a familiar emotional landscape than to rebuild it from the ground up. The heartbreaking irony is that adaptation often looks like love from the outside. The family keeps including Meemaw. They celebrate holidays together. They help one another during crises. They laugh, argue, forgive, and move forward. But forgiveness without accountability doesn't heal a pattern. It protects it. And once you understand why no one ever truly challenged Meemaw, a far more difficult question emerges. If her behavior was rooted in something deeper than personality, what invisible wound had she been protecting all along? What if she was spending it running away from grief? Up to this point, it has been easy to focus on the damage Meemaw caused. We've traced the emotional patterns. We've watched relationships bend around her need for control. We've seen how humor became armor, how independence became isolation, and how the people closest to her often carried consequences she never fully acknowledged. But psychology becomes dangerous the moment it stops asking 40 why, because behavior without context turns into judgment. And judgment rarely tells the whole story. To understand Meemaw, you have to remember something the show rarely places at the center of its narrative. By the time we meet her, she has already lived an entire lifetime. She is loved. She is lost. She has buried the man she expected to grow old with. That single fact changes everything. Grief doesn't always make people cry more. Sometimes it teaches them never to need anyone that deeply again. Psychologists refer to this as foodie complicated grief, a form of prolonged adaptation where loss permanently reshapes the way someone approaches future relationships. The pain isn't simply sadness. It is the belief that loving someone completely also means risking a level of devastation you are no longer willing to endure. For some people, that creates anxiety. For others, it creates distance. Meemaw seems to choose distance, not obvious distance, emotional distance. Think back to every relationship we've discussed. With Dale, she hesitates when commitment becomes permanent. With Sturgis, she pulls away when vulnerability deepens. With Mary, control replaces openness. With Sheldon, protection becomes easier than challenge. With Missy, observation quietly replaces emotional presence. Different people, same defense. That is rarely an accident. Trauma has a remarkable way of teaching the same lesson over and over until it becomes part of someone's identity. For Meemaw, that lesson appears to be painfully simple. Never need someone so much that losing them destroys you. From the outside, this philosophy looks empowering. Inside, it is exhausting, because maintaining emotional independence isn't a single decision. It is a daily performance. Every conversation must remain manageable. Every relationship must stay balanced on terms you can control. Every disappointment must be minimized before it becomes genuine heartbreak. Eventually, you are no longer protecting yourself from pain. You are protecting yourself from intimacy itself. That is one of the quiet tragedies of aging we rarely discuss. Young people often imagine that emotional wisdom naturally arrives with time. Sometimes it does. Sometimes age simply gives unhealthy coping mechanisms more years to become permanent. Meemaw has had decades to perfect emotional self-protection. By now, it feels less like a strategy and more like personality. Even she may not recognize the difference. There is another layer that makes this especially heartbreaking. Control often becomes increasingly important after profound loss, because loss is, by definition, uncontrollable. You couldn't stop it. You couldn't negotiate with it. You couldn't outsmart it. If you've spent years living with that reality, controlling the smaller parts of life begins to feel essential. You decide who gets close. You decide when conversations end. You decide how vulnerable you'll allow yourself to become. Choice becomes comfort. Not because you are selfish, because you are terrified of helplessness. Suddenly, so many of Meemaw's contradictions make sense. She isn't fearless. She is frightened of ever feeling powerless again. She isn't emotionally detached because she doesn't care. She is emotionally guarded because caring once cost her more than she believed she could survive twice. That doesn't excuse the hurt she causes, but it explains why the pattern repeats even when the consequences become obvious. People don't abandon lifelong survival strategies simply because someone points out they're unhealthy. They abandon them only when they believe vulnerability has become safer than protection. The heartbreaking truth is that Meemaw never quite reaches that point. She keeps choosing the familiar defense. She keeps believing that strength means standing alone. And in doing so, she unknowingly passes pieces of that survival strategy to the very family she is trying to protect. Which brings us to the most painful realization of all. The real tragedy isn't that Meemaw hurt the people she loved. It is that she probably believed every decision she made was another way of keeping herself, and them, from ever experiencing the kind of pain she'd spent a lifetime trying to outrun. After everything we've uncovered, it would be easy to end this story by calling Meemaw selfish. It would also be incomplete, because the most heartbreaking characters aren't the ones who intentionally hurt the people they love. They're the ones who never realize that the very strategies keeping them alive are slowly damaging everyone standing closest to them. That is where Meemaw's story becomes less about blame and more about tragedy. Throughout Young Sheldon, she consistently chooses independence over dependence, humor over vulnerability, confidence over uncertainty, and control over emotional risk. Those choices don't make her a villain. In many moments, they make her resilient. They allow her to survive loss, face adversity with remarkable courage, and become a source of stability when the Cooper family desperately needs one. Those qualities are real. They're also incomplete, because every strength carries a shadow. The same independence that inspires the people around her sometimes prevents genuine intimacy. The same confidence that makes her fearless in a crisis sometimes makes it difficult to admit when she is wrong. The same wit that comforts others occasionally redirects conversations that should have ended in accountability instead of laughter. That is the contradiction the series quietly leaves for viewers to wrestle with. Meemaw is capable of deep love, but love by itself isn't always enough. Psychology draws an important distinction between intention and impact. Intention reflects what we hope our actions will accomplish. Impact reflects what those actions actually produce in the lives of other people. Healthy relationships require us to care about both. Focusing only on intention allows us to say, "I meant well." Focusing only on impact ignores the complexity of being human. The healthiest people learn to hold both truths at the same time. Meemaw rarely reaches that balance. She genuinely believes she is protecting the people she loves. Whether she is defending Sheldon, encouraging Georgie, arguing with Mary, or navigating her own relationships, she usually acts from a place that feels loving to her. The problem is that protection without reflection can quietly become permission. Encouragement without boundaries can become enabling. Independence without vulnerability can become emotional distance. None of those outcomes require bad intentions, only repeated patterns. That is why so many viewers connect with Meemaw, despite her flaws. Most of us know someone like her. Maybe it is a parent, a grandparent, a friend, or even ourselves. Someone who would do almost anything for the people they love, yet struggles to hear how their own behavior affects those same people. Someone who mistakes being strong for never needing anyone. Someone who believes that making everyone laugh is the same as making everyone feel safe. Those people aren't monsters, they're human. And that is exactly what makes their stories so difficult to untangle. Because if every harmful relationship were built on cruelty, life would be much simpler. We'd know who to avoid, we'd know who to blame, but families rarely work that way. More often, they're shaped by ordinary people carrying extraordinary wounds into relationships that deserve something healthier than the coping strategies they learned decades earlier. Meemaw reminds us of that uncomfortable reality. Her greatest flaw may not be selfishness in the traditional sense. It may be emotional self-protection that became so deeply woven into her identity that she could no longer distinguish it from love itself. That is a subtle difference, is change entire lives. When you look back through the series with that perspective, the jokes sound a little different, the arguments feel heavier. The moments of tenderness become more bittersweet because you can see both the affection she offers and the vulnerability she still can't quite give away. You don't have to stop loving Meemaw to recognize those contradictions. In fact, recognizing them may be the reason she remains one of the most compelling characters in Young Sheldon. She isn't memorable because she is perfect, she is memorable because she reflects something painfully familiar. The idea that our greatest strengths, left unquestioned, can slowly become our greatest weaknesses. And perhaps that is the real lesson her story leaves behind. Not that love inevitably hurts people, but that love grows strongest when courage isn't measured by how fiercely we protect ourselves, but by how willing we are to let the people we love see the parts of us that are still afraid.